We're going to look at uh, four, maybe five stories of dinners, which happen in the Bible. Some of these stories are famous, but we don't get a chance to talk about them much, so we will this time. And I just this is going to be one where I'm not going to be lecturing a lot. I'd rather just encourage conversation and see what your reactions to these stories are. Um, and it's Pride Month. Pride Month has just started, so one of the stories has a sort of pride element to it. Um, and I named this Entertaining Strangers because one way or another, all of these stories have strangers who come to dinner, one way or another.
Mm.
It's a sort of interesting kind of way of looking at Christian ethics. Hey, Anne Louise, nice to see you. Okay, so the first story, we're going to do this in two halves. The first half is from the Hebrew Scriptures. Second half will be from the New Testament. And the first story is a famous story about Abraham when he had some visitors for dinner who he did not expect. Now, Abraham was the man who had lived in the region of the world called Chaldea back then. We would call it Iraq now. And Abraham was grew up in Chaldea and was basically on the move through the Fertile Crescent. And God one day says, "Hey, I want you to drop everything and follow me." And this was news to Abraham because he hadn't really heard about the one God before. He came from a place where they worshiped many gods. But Abraham decided to take the chance. And we all know Abraham because he's the guy who, when he was told by God, "I want you to sacrifice your son," dragged poor Isaac to the top of the mountain and was ready to do him in with a knife until God stopped him. So, but before that happened, um, Abraham was very old when he became the father of Isaac. And his wife, Sarah, was very old too. And this story that we're going to hear bears on the conception of Isaac. So this first story is really long. I didn't want to cut anything out because it'll, I think, make for interesting conversation. So I think we need everybody to read. So Nadine, the way this works is I'll put slides on the screen, which have pictures as well as words. And then basically, if everybody's good to read on this one, because we need everybody's help, everybody just takes a turn reading one page. So the words are on the screen. So is everybody okay with reading today?
I
Uh,
think so.
Yep. Okay, great. In that case, I'll just call out your names as we go, and I'll just do you on the order that I see you on the screen. And if there's any extra at the end, I'll just do it. So why don't we have a moment of prayer, though, since we are diving into the Bible. So why don't we take two deep breaths? So one, let it out. Another one, and let it out. Loving God, we come to you this day, eager to hear your word. We pray that you can open our minds and our hearts so that we can receive inspiration from these words of Holy Scripture and be attentive to what each other are saying explicitly and implicitly, and hopefully come out of this session a little wiser than we were before. In Jesus' name, the one who had dinner with absolutely everybody. Amen. So, Wendy, perhaps you could go first.
Abraham and Sarah's dinner with the angels, Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat in the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw three men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from his tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground.
Great, thank you. And Laura Lane, if you could go next, please.
He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not, am I okay? Yes. Do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said."
Great, thank you. And Nadine, would you mind reading this next page, please? Oh, you'll need to unmute yourself, though. Are you unmuted?
No.
There we go.
And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, I'm new to this, I'm sorry. I can't see all the text because of your pictures. Cute.
What you can do is, you see all the pictures up at the top, it gives you an option. There's sort of like one bar, a thick bar, and then two bars, and a whole bunch of bars. See up at the very top of the video window? Just click on the smallest one on the far left.
Oh, okay, sorry, thank you. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And let's see who's next in my line. Rosie, if you could go next, please.
Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them unto the tree where they ate. They said to him, where's your wife Sarah? And he said, there in the tent.
Great, thank you. And Peter, are you with us?
Yep.
Great, if you could read the next part, please.
Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women.
Which is the Bible's very polite way of saying she was past reproductive age.
Yeah.
Joyce, could you go next, please? Sorry, Joyce, you're muted.
Could someone take my place? My eyes can't see the script well enough.
Sure thing, I'll do that. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, oh yes, you did laugh. Isla, could you go next, please? And you'll need to unmute yourself, Isla.
Then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom, and Abram went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him.
Thanks, Isla. And Sheila, if you could go next, and just make sure you're unmuted, please.
No, for I have chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him.
Great, thanks very much. And Anne, could you go next, please?
Sure. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know.
Great, thank you. And Jocelyn, if you could go next, please.
So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham came near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 righteous who are in it?"
Great, thank you. And let's see. Anne Louise, could you go next, please?
Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?
Great, and Eleanor, if you could go next, please.
And the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will forgive the whole place for their sake." Abraham answered, "Let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And God said, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there."
Great, thanks. And I'll do the last parts. Again, Abraham spoke to him. "Suppose 40 are found there." God answered, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then Abraham said, "Oh, do not let the Lord be angry if I speak. Suppose 30 are found there." God answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, "Then let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." God answered, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then Abraham said, "Oh, do not let the Lord be angry if I speak just once more. Suppose 10 are found there." God answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And then the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Okay, so that's our first dinner party. So it's a very rich story, lots of things going on there. So any first impressions?
It's very serious, the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, I mean, it's, it's like people don't want to smile or even pretend. It might be nice. They're very direct in what is being said.
I guess one person has a laugh, though. Who is that?
Oh, Sarah.
Yeah, and why does she laugh?
Not me, not me.
Yeah. She's supposed to be around 90 years old, 80 or 90 years old. So she's going, I'm going to have a baby? Be serious. But yeah, Rosie, you're right. I mean, it's really serious stuff. It's Abraham is being told by God earlier in the scriptures that he is going to become the father of a great nation, the Jewish people. And frankly, by extension, the Christian folks as well as the Muslims, as it turned out. And so the stakes are very, very high. And on the one hand, you've got this narrative of birth, but what's the other story that's also happening here?
Death.
Death. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of death, Joyce?
Destructive death.
Yeah. Of what?
Oh, the
People
people
of Sodom.
the city.
Yeah. The whole city of Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
Yes.
The twin city system. So yeah, very, very intense. But so that's the broad outline of it. So let's go back to the beginning. So one day Abraham's just minding his own business in his tent, and what happens?
He sees 3 strangers coming toward the tent.
Right. And what does he do?
He invites them in.
Invites them.
Yeah, yeah. So hospitality, rule number 1, right? Abraham invites them in. And does he treat them well?
Yes.
Very well.
What does he do for them?
He cooks for them. He gets the fatted calf, I think, or the best one.
Yeah, he gets the best calf, and he gets the best of something else too.
The flour.
The flour, that's right.
But he doesn't eat with them.
Yeah, he just serves them, right?
As though he's the butler.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Which is interesting, right? Because he doesn't know that these guys are angels, right? He does not know that when they first walk up. They're just three travelers who've just appeared on his doorstep, as it were, since he's living in a tent. And yet he rolls out the red carpet for them. So this is our first instance of entertaining strangers. Many years ago, at the first church where I belonged, we put out a cookbook and we called it Entertaining Strangers. And it was Amanda came up with the title, and it was inspired by this story. And in the Middle East at that time, and still apparently, particularly among desert cultures, entertaining a complete stranger is really, really important. It's what makes life possible, because you could be that stranger someday. You could just be wandering around in the desert and desperate for a meal or some water, and if you get denied by everybody you meet, then you're just going to die. So there's a reciprocity built in here, which is very, very important.
Is it possible that Abraham thought perhaps that these strangers, these men, had come up from Sodom or Gomorrah? And I mean, I think he's very lonely, sitting in the opening of his tent, and because he prostrates himself before them when they arrive, and he's very open to them. He's obviously very keen to have company. And by showing generosity and good hospitality, maybe he's thinking, these people just need to be shown a righteous way of living, and they will start to be, maybe I can be the person who shows them how to live, and they'll go back to their town and live righteously.
Maybe. Yeah, it doesn't say that in the text, but it's certainly possible. And I mean, and he does speak on behalf of Sodom, right? Not because he's from Sodom, but and what does he say to God once he realizes he's talking to God about the fate of Sodom?
He bargains with them.
Yeah.
Are you going to kill the few righteous along with everybody else?
But we also know that his brother and all his family live in Sodom and Gomorrah, because that comes later in the story.
That's
so
right.
To me, he was thinking about his brother.
Yeah, and this is something which we should always recognize. It's funny, I was talking to someone recently about who felt that God was pushing them in a particular direction, and I was saying, you can say no to God, right? You can say that's too much. I don't have the strength to do all that you're asking. And the Jewish faith is really, really clear about this, and it's something us Christians should take seriously too. That, God can make demands, and you can say, I can't do that yet, God. That's just too much for me. And the name Israel, right, was the name that was given to Jacob after his night of wrestling with an angel. Israel means to wrestle with God. Anytime you hear El in a name, it means God, right? As in it's short for Elohim. So the nation of Israel are the people who wrestle with God. They're not just saying, yeah, whatever you want. They'll wrestle with God. So the fact that Abraham hears that God is going to wipe out this city, and he starts bargaining, and it may be a test, right? But we know that God goes through with it, right? So, and it gives us a hint, foreshadowing, this must be a really bad town if God says, I will save the town if there's even 5 good people in it. So it must be a pretty terrible town, right? But, there's Abraham, advocating for them, trying to make sure that even 5 people don't get destroyed, even if everybody else is rotten. So Abraham obviously has a very big heart, right?
Yes, it shows what kind of person he is.
Yeah.
I think it tests the patience of God too, because God says yes, he grants that, and then he comes back, and then he comes back, and then he comes back. So God says, all right.
I'm
all right already.
Yeah. In fairness, God has a lot of time on God's hands, So what kind of, if we had to summarize what kind of host Abraham is, what sort of host is he?
Generous. Generous.
Caring, very caring.
Yeah. Does he ask these three people anything about themselves?
No.
Yeah, there's no means test. They don't have to prove that they're important people or anything. He just sees them and says, "Let me feed you, and I'll feed you the best that I've got." Right? And I don't know, I hear echoes, well, not echoes, I guess, foreshadowing of the prodigal son story here, right? Where the father receives the son who's been wallowing with pigs, who screwed up and did everything wrong, and yet the father says, "Get all the best stuff. Get the fatted calf. Let's party. He's back." Right? Abraham has that kind of largesse here for these three strangers. And I wonder if he'd been stingy, whether God would have showed God's hand. You know, like, would God have admitted who he was? And would God have come through with the offer to Sarah, right?
Maybe not.
You know, if Abraham had been stingy. I mean, it's interesting. There's a kind of reciprocity here, right? Abraham offers everything, and God replies with everything plus more, right? This incredible gift of fertility to an old woman.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it kind of suggests that generosity will be repaid with generosity. God will always outdo you, but it's not a bad thing for us to start with generosity and see where God takes it, right? Because Abraham certainly doesn't anticipate that he's going to get paid back for this dinner, and yet he does get paid back. An impossible son.
Yes, I mean, he Abram even says to them, you know, let me just wash your feet, and then you can go on your way. And I think while that's happening, he buzzes around in the background and says, I think I'm going to make him a meal too.
Yeah. And Sarah's laughter is made canonical, and that Isaac's name is "she laughed." That's what that name means. Right? So the laughter of an old woman going, "Ha! I'm gonna have a baby," becomes his name. So
I think it's, in terms of testing, it's Abraham and Sarah were able to have a good life with just themselves, with very little company. They were fundamentally good people, and so good things, I mean, this isn't always the case, of course, in our lives, but good things are visited upon them.
yeah, one should keep in mind, Abraham and Sarah are extraordinarily wealthy people. They have lots of slaves. They have lots and lots of cattle. Abraham's a powerful and wealthy person who has been blessed by God. I mean, there's no question that this wealth comes from God's favor, but they're not living a simple cottage life. And in fact, Abraham probably had it well within his means to just order a servant to do all this work for him, but he doesn't. He does it himself, which isn't even, you know, the kind of, he and Sarah, right? I mean, Sarah would have been making the bread. And this story makes something, you know, it takes a while to cook the fatted calf and to make the bread, right? So this thing seems to take about, you know, 20 minutes, but really we're looking at hours of time together, right?
But I think people that travel on the desert, they're used to time being like that. Not like us.
They're not in a hurry.
That's right.
No.
Maybe that explains why Abraham's negotiation with God is so long-winded. They've got time, right?
Right.
So in this story, we see evinced generosity of spirit on Abraham's part, because he pulls out the stops for these three strangers, and on God's part, because God says, okay, I'm going to give you this impossible child, right? So generosity begets generosity. And then Abraham's generosity extends to complete strangers, for the most part, the people of Sodom. And he does everything he can to try and save their lives, right? And God does say, I'm going to send my people down there to see if it's as bad as what we have been told, right? So God hasn't completely made up God's mind yet. God's going to send some agents down there to see what the deal is down in Sodom, and then make the decision about whether to destroy it. And I should just, we're going to keep reading the text. There's no omissions here. We're going to go straight into the Sodom and Gomorrah destruction story. I just want to point out a couple of things about this. Sodom and Gomorrah were believed to have been next to the Dead Sea in Israel. And the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because it's a Dead Sea. It's a sea which is being cut off from draining into the Red Sea. And it's an inland saltwater sea. And the salt content is built up over the centuries and thousands of years so high that nothing can live in that water. There's no fish, there's no life in it at all. It's truly a dead sea. And it's very weird. Like, I've been there, and there's a hotel right next to the Dead Sea. And if you walk along the coast, like the shoreline near the hotel, you know, people drink drinks in plastic cups, right? Well, those plastic cups inevitably blow off the tables and they end up in the Dead Sea. And when they lap up onto the shore, they take these strange shapes because the salt crystallizes around the cups. And branches, same thing. Anything that falls into that water, the salt just colonizes it. And as a result, the salt makes sculptures out of things. So when we hear about, at the very end of the story, Lot's wife being frozen into a pillar of salt, the early Christians, when they were writing about this story, said that they had been to the Dead Sea and they had seen that pillar of salt. It's really there. And that is, I mean, I'm not saying that it's Lot's wife who's really there, but those sorts of shapes of salt and so forth are entirely realistic given the way the chemistry of that place works. And the area around the Dead Sea, as you can imagine, is not fertile. And if anybody found even a bit of ruins near the Dead Sea, they'd say, what happened to this town? What happened to this sea? How did it end up destroyed? Because something terrible must have happened here for an entire sea to die and for the land around it to be so devastated and dry and terrible. So the Sodom and Gomorrah story is a just so story, right? It's a story that's trying to explain something which people are living with now, which is a dead area, and saying, well, something bad here must have happened. Whatever happened here to the people, they must have been bad people for their sea and the towns around it to be destroyed like this. So I'm just trying to say that we don't have to believe that the Sodom and Gomorrah story is historically true, but one of the reasons it's in the Bible and it's in this particular place is because this area of Israel looks like it was destroyed. Okay. All right, so let's see, for the Lot story, we'll need 11 readers, which is basically all of you again. So if you don't mind, I'll just call it you as we go. All right, and Joyce, you were having a hard time reading the screen, right? So
yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so let's go have dinner in Sodom. Wendy, if you could go first, please.
Lot's dinner party in Sodom. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside from your servant's house and spend the night." Pardon me, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way.
Great, thank you. And Isla, if you could go next, please.
They said, no, we will spend the night in the square. But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house.
Great, thank you. And Laura, if you, Laura, if you could go next, please.
And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate.
Rosie, if you could go next, please.
But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, just a second, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded in the house, and they called to Lot Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them to us so that they may know them, so that we may know them.
Great. Okay, and let's see, Sheila, if you could go next, please.
Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them.
Thank you. And Anne, could you read this page, please?
Sure. Then they pressed hard against the who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. But the 2 angels reached out and pulled Lot in and bolted the door. Then they blinded the men of Sodom so they couldn't find the doorway.
Thank you. And Jocelyn, could you do this part, please?
Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it.
All right, thank you. And Nadine, if you could read this page, please.
So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city.
Great, thank you. And Anne-Louise, could you read the next page, please?
And they had brought them inside. They said, flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed.
Great, thank you. And Eleanor, could you read this part, please?
Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah. Whoops, just wait. And Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground.
Great, thank you. And Lawrence, nice to see you. Would you mind reading this last page?
Yes, sorry I'm late. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so lots to talk about there too. So any first impressions?
Imagine him throwing his daughters under the bus like that.
Yeah. That was not generous.
Yeah, that didn't impress me right off the bat. And then he goes and he does, when they do flee, they don't take the sons-in-laws with them. They just take the 2 daughters. So, and the idea now of when you look back, turning into something immobile, that also comes from Greek tragedies, I think, doesn't it? That the concept of not looking back.
I'm not sure about that actually, but certainly it's good advice in life often to not look back, not to linger, not to perseverate over things which have happened to you in the past if you can avoid it, right? You know, all of us have known some people who've gotten really hung up on the past in a way which isn't healthy. And it's also horrifying what happened, right? Like to watch a city go up in flames like that would be traumatic, right? Just as if you saw a city being torched by a nuclear bomb, right? Or Dresden, for instance, with the firebombing. Seeing that kind of thing can ruin you too. So I think it's a compassionate act to say, don't watch this, you know. But yes, I mean, offering up the daughters, not cool by today's standards, obviously. What does it say about Lot's, what's Lot's version of hospitality?
Not as good as Abraham's.
No.
Why is that?
I don't know. And another thing about Lot, how come he knows the angels when he sees them, whereas Abraham does not?
I don't think Lot does know the angels, that they're angels. I think they're just two men to him.
Okay.
I found that confusing as well, because and the pictures you've got with it clearly visually show they're angels, but I didn't know how he would know that either.
Yeah,
because they were from God.
Yeah, the unfortunately, it's hard to find art that depicts this without slapping wings on everybody, like on all the angels. But in the story, there's no indication that Lot knows that they're angels. He doesn't expect them to have any superpowers, right?
Okay.
He doesn't say, "Hey, why don't you use some superpowers and get rid of the guys outside?" Right? That doesn't happen. He just thinks
The only difference between Abram's hospitality and Lot's hospitality I noticed was they're dealing with a time crunch, because Lot provides unleavened bread, whereas Abraham maybe had kind of the strangers appeared in the heat of the sun, so they appeared at midday and they kind of maybe took until the evening to feed them. Whereas I think by the time they get to Sodom and Gomorrah, the day is moving on, and so Lot just prepares unleavened bread for them, which I assume was to be quick, in order to get them something to eat. And maybe being in a town, they had prepared food. They didn't have to slaughter the calf and cook it like you do out in the fields. Maybe the local butcher, the Lot's wife used to go to the supermarket and get prepared food.
They could go to the shop.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, we are told at the beginning of this story that it's evening when the two strangers arrive at the city gate. And Lot greets them. He stands up and he bows down, just like Abraham did, right? Abraham also bowed down in front of these two guys. And what's interesting is the two angels say, "Nah, we're good. We're just going to sleep in the square." Right? And what does Lot say?
Oh, no.
No, come to my house.
Right. So Lot's actually being a good host, right? He's insisting that they come for a meal, and he says, and then you can sleep the night before you go on your way. So Lot's doing a pretty good job of being a good host, but Lot is an alien in the town, right? Like Lot and Abraham had come from Chaldea, so, like anybody can tell by just listening to them that they're not locals. And the rest of the town knows that Lot is not a local, which is why they give him a hard time when things start getting ugly. But Lot gives them dinner. So far, so good. Two strangers, so he's fulfilling the hospitality codes of the day. And then what happens? How does the town react to all this?
They want to kill the men.
Yeah, what do they want to do? Let's talk about that. What do they say?
Let them out.
Bring
They
them up.
want to know them. So I don't know
Bring
whether
them up.
the knowing is in a sexual way, like the word knowing is often used in the Bible to mean to be intimate with somebody. Maybe they just want to be intimate because they just want something fresh in their lives, in their life of because I figure if you think this story is true and you've given us an out, Stephen, to think that this is a myth or a just so story to explain the Dead Sea existence, if you think it's a true story, then maybe because they couldn't fish and maybe because they couldn't farm, then the thing that was really awful about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah is that they maybe just relied on trading, and maybe they were unscrupulous traders, and they actually mostly robbed people in order to get anything to live on. And so maybe they just saw two strangers arriving and they're thinking, you know, maybe we'll kidnap them and hold them for ransom. What can, you know, we'll get to know them intimately of their lives, and we'll see what advantage we can take of these men.
Okay.
For our own gain.
Okay. The trick with that thesis is what Lot offers as an alternative.
Yes, he offers his daughters for sex.
Right. So which suggests that the men were outside were probably asking for sex in the first place. Saying, I can't let you have sex with these two men that I am entertaining, because that would make me a bad host, but I can let you have sex with my daughters. Which, you know, violates our modern sensibility massively. But this was written some 2,500 years ago about something which happened even hundreds of years ago before that, at a time where society was highly patriarchal and a man basically owned his daughters. And the pecking order here is pretty clear. You show good hospitality to strange men, even at the cost of your own daughters if necessary. That's horrific to us, but it shows that Lot means it, that he wants to be a good host. And fortunately, do Lot's daughters go outside to be raped?
Nope.
What happens? Why doesn't that happen?
Well, the guests keep them in.
That's right. So the angels stop that from happening, right? So God's not going to let that happen, right? So Lot may have a skewed sense of good hospitality, putting his daughters at risk, but God's not going to let those daughters be at risk, right? So if you're worried about the immorality of this story in terms of the trading of the daughters, at no time is God going to let those daughters be raped so that these angels can be safe, right? So God's on the right side here, fortunately, right? But now, you know, the word sodomy comes from this story, right? Because the assumption is those men outside the house want to have anal relations with the two men inside. They want to do it to these two men rather than Lot, because these two men are strangers. So they're disposable. And as you said, Wendy, they're fresh meat, right? And we know from the previous part of this story that God has said to Abraham, I have heard all sorts of terrible things about this town, so I'm going to go check it out. I'm going to have my agents go check it out and see if it really should be destroyed. And unfortunately, it says every man in town was outside of Lot's house. Like all of them were.
Yes, that's right, it did.
Every single one of them was outside of Lot's house. So that means they're all guilty, right? And how many people was God willing to spare the town for?
10 or 5.
It's 5, I think, right? Yeah.
I thought it was 10.
10. It was 10.
It was 10? Okay. So how many people leave the town under the angel's care?
None.
4.
One. Oh,
Four.
Lot.
4.
4, right? Yeah.
Well,
Lot, 2 daughters, and Lot's
Boy.
wife, who turns around. The sons-in-laws refuse the offer. So there aren't actually 10 people worth saving, right? There's only 4. So God's deal holds, right? There aren't enough to save to keep the town from being destroyed, but he does save the ones who are good, right?
That's right.
So God doesn't destroy any innocents in the town. He only destroys the ones who have either ignored the offer or were acting in an awful way. And this being Pride Month, it's sort of important to sort of unpack this a little bit, because if you ask many Christians today what was the crime in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, they'll say, well, homosexual sex. That's what the crowd wanted. But if you ask the Hebrew scriptures or the New Testament what the crime of Sodom was, homosexuality is only mentioned once in the entire Bible that we use, and it's in the letter of Jude in the New Testament, where it mentions sexual immorality. It doesn't even specify it. But all the other times, and I'm just going to share a screen here. a second. Yeah, okay, there we go. There's a lot of references in the Bible to Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's usually just to talk about how this was a town that was destroyed, so you don't want to end up like them. That comes up a lot. And then there are these references that come up where, and sorry, I didn't make a slide out of this, but these are the ones that say why it was destroyed. In Ezekiel, it says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom," like your sister city Sodom. "She and her daughters had pride, excessive food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." And then in 3rd Maccabees it says, "You, God, consumed with fire and sulfur the people of Sodom who acted arrogantly, who were notorious for their vices, and you made them an example to those who should come afterward rather." And then in Jude, this tiny letter in the New Testament that you've probably never even heard in church because it's considered so obscure and small and unimportant. It says, "Likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner as they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." But all, like, you can, if you want to use, if you go online, there's this site called BibleGateway.com, which I use practically every day when I'm working. So BibleGateway.com. You can search the Bible really easily. It's like Google for the Bible. If you put in Sodom, you'll see that there's like 50 references, and virtually all of them say you don't want to be like Sodom because you heard what happened to them. They got destroyed by God. And then there's those couple that say the reason they were destroyed was because they were terrible to the needy and terrible to the poor and terrible to strangers, right? This is like the ultimate example of inhospitality, right? Being inhospitable, where two strangers come into a man's house and suddenly there's a crowd outside saying, "Let them out here, we want to do violence to them." So the one of the things which queer theologians say is they say, listen, the Bible doesn't say that the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah is homosexuality. The Bible says the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah is that they were cruel to strangers and the poor. They were cruel to those who were weaker than themselves. So when modern day Christians pass laws to deny goods and services to queer people, the people who are being like Sodom and Gomorrah are the people who are passing the laws because they are being inhospitable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, all right, so more comparisons between Abraham and Lot. Abraham's a generous host, Lot is too, but Lot's town is not, right? Lot's town is cruel and terrible and ends up having fire rain down on it. And it's sort of, I mean, it's pretty harsh lesson, but you know, it's be good to people or else. You know, God's favor will be withdrawn from you, and bad things can happen when that happens. So entertain strangers when you can, seems to be the lesson in these two stories. Okay, so now let's spin forward to the New Testament. But any questions before we go on? Comments?
I'm wondering, you suggested instead of the immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah, it was more a hospitality thing and strangers. I've always had the impression just the opposite. But is that because of what I learned in church, or I'm not questioning your interpretation, but I'm saying it's unfamiliar.
Yeah, well, what happened in church history is that as the status of queer people declined in the West, the interpretation of the Sodom and Gomorrah story changed. It became a parable about sexual immorality, specifically homosexuality. But you know, I've read a lot of the early Christian writings, like the stuff which post-date the New Testament. Like I've read centuries worth of that stuff now. And it's only in like the 4th and 5th centuries that Sodom and Gomorrah gets this reputation as being a town that was punished for homosexuality. And that happens to coincide with a downturn in the reputation of homosexuals in Roman and Greek society at the same time. And what happens is, generally speaking, big cities tend to be the place where gay people hang out. And the reason for that is that if you're living in an agrarian society, like everybody was back then, families need to have a lot of children because infant mortality rates are high. And so, and women and men both need to be devoted to fertility for that same reason. You need to be just pumping out as many babies as you can to keep ahead of the demographic disaster, which is infant mortality as well as disease and injury, right? People who grow up and realize they don't want to get married, or they absolutely, they don't want to be part of the reproductive machine, they tend to gravitate towards cities, because in a city, you can be a merchant and you don't need to have 10 children. You can run a shop. You can be a gay person who runs a shop. And in Roman society, being out was perfectly okay. It was perfectly all right. There were emperors who were gay. There were emperors who had trans partners. All this was above board. In Roman society, the average household, the average freeborn male who had a wife and slaves in the house, he could have sex with any of the slaves that he wanted because they were his property. And of course, he could have sex with prostitutes as well. And it didn't matter what gender they were. So Roman society was frankly far more liberal about this than we are. Where am I going with this? So, but what happens though, is as the Roman Empire starts to tank and Roman society becomes less urban and more rural, then the rural attitudes start becoming common sense, which is that being gay and being non-productive is a danger to society because it's a danger to fertility. And religion is used to emphasize that it's fertility at all costs. Right? And Christianity becomes yoked to that idea, where women should just always be having babies, birth control is wrong, and our religion becomes a pro-heteronormative fertility religion, right? And you still see that with Catholics now, right? York Minster Region does not want to fly the pride flag during Pride Month, right? Catholic attitudes have not budged much on this. So yeah, and it's not until really the 12th century that it becomes legally really difficult for homosexuals in the West. And that coincides with the rise of what we would call the state, which didn't really exist before that. It was just minor fiefdoms everywhere. And the story changes, and Sodom and Gomorrah gets remembered as a story about the perils of homosexual sex because it'll get your town destroyed. So it should be avoided at all costs. So interpretation of stories changes, right? But we should all keep in mind that when Paul talked about sex, he said it's better just not to have it. It's better to be celibate, right? So it's not that if you read the New Testament closely, if you listen to what Christ says, he says you should hate your mother and father if you're going to go forward spiritually, because you need to turn your back on all those values which you inherited from your family and really make up your own mind about the spiritual path that you're on. And Paul says, you're better off without a wife, you're better off without a husband, stay celibate, that's the best way to be a Christian. So the idea that Christianity is inherently a pro-family value fertility religion is at odds with what scriptures actually say. But that didn't prevent anybody from saying that that's the way it is. Okay, that's my pride plug for today. All right, so let's.
But that's what they're saying in Africa now, in Nigeria, where they're persecuting the homophobia. They're using these stories to justify the laws that they're enacting.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Uganda passed that law last week, making it a capital offense to have gay sex, right? Yeah, just like awful.
And Nigeria is not much better.
Yeah, and not coincidentally, those are countries that were evangelized by American evangelicals, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not seeing African culture per se there, you're seeing African culture after the arrival of Christianity, and a very, very conservative form of Christianity at that. So I don't know enough about African culture before Christians arrived, but I know that the white evangelicals went over there. And you see this reflected, right, in what's happened to the Anglicans, where at the worldwide level, the Anglicans can't make a decision about same-sex marriage because the places where the missionaries went have provided such a conservative interpretation of things that there's no consensus, right? So all of these things continue to play out. The story has had way too much influence. Anyway, okay, so let's move on. So back to dinner parties. So, we're going to go now to the New Testament, where we're going to look at another pair of dinner parties. If the first two that we saw, it started off good and then it went bad, this time it's the other way around. We're going to start with a bad dinner party, and then we're going to find it paired up with a good dinner party. And I'm not doing the pairing. What we're going to read is exactly the way it appears in the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so we're going to go first to Herod's birthday party. King Herod, the Tetrarch Herod, had a birthday party in Galilee. John the Baptist had been proselytizing down at the Jordan River, baptizing people and including Jesus. And John the Baptist had pointed out that when Herod married his brother's wife, by forcing his brother to divorce her so he could marry her, that was against Jewish law. And he said this out loud, loud and proud, and he got in trouble with Herod, and particularly Herod's new wife. So Herod had him arrested and put into the dungeon, basically, of the palace where he lived. So that's the backstory to this. Herod is having a birthday party, and he's invited all the hoi polloi of Galilee to his birthday party. And we're going to read what happened next. This time I only need 7 readers, so you don't all have to read. Do you want me to just pick 7 as I go? So you don't have to, okay. Sue and Peter, do you mind if I pick on you guys since you haven't read anything yet? Okay, so Sue Seisman, if you could read this, please.
King Herod heard of the Lord's miracles, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers were at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised.
Great, thank you. And Peter, would you mind reading this next part?
Oh. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him.
Thank you. And Anne Louise, would you mind reading this part, please?
An opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced.
Great, thank you. And Peter Heinz, are you there?
Yep. She pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you even half of my kingdom.
Great, thank you. And Eleanor, could you read this part, please?
She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She replied, the head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her.
Great, thank you. And Lawrence, could you read this part, please?
Immediately, the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison.
Great, and I'll read this part. And brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took John's body and laid it in a tomb. Okay, so what do you think of that dinner party?
It's grisly.
Revolting.
Oh, also it shows that one should never be a puppet king, because obviously Herod was dissolute. He was willing to give half of what he was supposed to be in charge of away. He liked listening to stories or thinking or the good teachings of John, but he was also happy just to watch dancing going on. Like, he's not really, he's not an active politician, serving the better needs of his people.
Right.
He's just vacuous and lost.
Mm-hmm. Other impressions of John? I mean, or Herod rather, it's his birthday, right? So are those guests up there of their free will?
We aren't told.
We're not told, but if the king invites you to his birthday party, do you say no?
Guess not.
Right? Like it's dangerous to say no when someone important who rules your fate, invites you to a party. You better go, right? And does Herod come across as a mature person?
No.
How come?
Well, it sounds like a stupid question, offer to give half his kingdom for whatever this girl wanted. Like, how much had he had to drink?
That's right. And this girl is his stepdaughter, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? He's married his brother's ex-wife, and she's got a daughter, so that makes this young woman who's doing, this sexy dance for him, his stepdaughter, and he's delighted and probably all turned on, right? Hey, I'll give you half of my kingdom. Just name the price. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
It's his niece too.
Yeah, that's right. His stepdaughter and his niece at the same time. Yeah, exactly.
And
So
she's
yeah,
probably not very old as well. So goes out to her mother, and her mother just manipulates her right back. And, the girl's just used as a tool by everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And, this is a dinner party, right? And what does the mother ask for?
A head.
On
On a plate.
a plate. Yeah.
Plate.
And this is explicitly a banquet, right? So it's like, man, oh man, when evil people get together, bad things happen, and watch out for what's served, like this is kind of, I love this story because it manages to pack so many things into such a brief span. And one of the things it says is, this is an evil dinner party where a prophet's head is served up for dinner, essentially, right? They didn't bring the head on a spike, they brought it on a plate. Right? So it's a parody of a dinner party, an evil parody of a dinner party where the rich are just feeding on their egos and with unintended consequences, which cost the life of a very good man, right? So if it feels kind of revolting, that's the point, right? Like, it's supposed to feel kind of revolting. So I want you to sort of keep that in suspension. And now we're going to read what happens right after that in the Gospel of Mark. Okay. And this one's quite brief. So tell you what, so you can drink this in and make the comparisons in your head, I'll read the next part. Okay. Feeding the 5,000. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." The disciples said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. Okay, so that is exactly how it's presented in the Gospel of Mark. We go from Herod's evil dinner party to the feeding of the 5,000. So any impressions, any comparisons there?
I would say a lot of satisfaction for one thing, that they could all be fed, right? And satisfied. Yeah.
And the people wanted to be there.
Yeah.
They chose to be there.
Right.
And that Jesus was looking after his disciples. They'd been busy. I guess he'd sent them out on their 2 by 2 or the 70 or something. And he said, "You must be tired." I mean, they were grown men, but he still interpreted what they had been doing in a caring way. And that's a big contrast to the stepfather, uncle, and horrible mother, the way they treated the dancing girl. Right? They, as you said, they just used her. Where here's Jesus showing what you should do to people who are close to you. You should be thinking about their needs and helping them meet their needs.
Yeah, he's thinking about his disciples because they're tired from what they've been doing. So he says, "Hey, let's go off and go to a quiet place and we can rest up." And then what happens instead? Anne? Oh, you're muted, Anne. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I my mind was not over here. So I'm not able to answer the question, but can I make my point?
Yeah, sure.
I was thinking the plate with the head of John the Baptist is one feast, and this feast was the loaves and the fish, and they fed multitudes. And I'm thinking now of the Last Supper, which was a feast, and I'm thinking now of how we share the bread of life at the table and how it feeds. So it's just looking at the head of John the Baptist on a plate, and then feeding the crowd, and now the Last Supper. So I'm thinking, that's what I was thinking as you were talking. Sorry, I didn't answer the question.
Oh, no. I think that's a nice thought. Yeah, it's a progression, right? Because the feast, like the food at Herod's banquet, is death. He serves death for dinner, right? He serves a silenced man, a silenced prophet who's just a dead head on a plate, right? Whereas right next to that, Mark puts this feast where things just get bigger and bigger and bigger in a life-giving way, right? And you've just taken it even one step further, where through communion, the whole world is fed, right? People all over the world are fed on a regular basis, right? So there's such a difference. Herod was, what can you do for me, right? And Jesus is, what can I do for you? What can I do for you, disciples? And then a whole crowd of people shows up and he says, what can I do for them? And it says, and Jesus took pity on them and he taught them, right? So he's thinking of the crowd now. And then the disciples, what happens? Let's just walk through what happens with the disciples when it gets to be late in the day and everybody's hungry. What do the disciples say they should do?
They said, send them away and go and find something in the towns
Right.
to eat.
Yeah, the disciples are learning to think about other people's needs. They bring up the whole concept, hey, it's supper time. There's a whole bunch of people here and we're going to be really, really hungry. And,
and
so Jesus is looking after them and they're learning to look after other people.
Yeah, and they have no reason to believe that Jesus can do this fishes and loaves trick, right? Like, it take a lot of faith, at that point to think that was possible. And Jesus hasn't done the really big things like walk across the water or anything. That happens next. So it's understandable the disciples would say, listen, we better send them home because they're hungry and we can't feed them. But what happens next? What does Jesus say right after that?
You feed
what do you have?
Bring me what you have.
Yeah, he says, first of all, why don't you feed them? And they go, how could we feed them? We don't have that much money. And then Jesus says, well, bring me what you've got. So Jesus has asked them to solve the problem. They can't solve the problem without sending the people away. And then Jesus says, I've got a plan, right? Whereas Herod says, I'll give you everything. I'll give you half of everything to this dancing girl. Just name what you want, right? He gives up his power into the hands of this, selfish girl who consults her selfish mother, who asks for this selfish feast of death, right? Whereas Jesus doesn't take the advice of the disciples, right? The disciples say, let's send them home. And Jesus says, I have a better idea, right? Herod gives away his authority and disaster strikes. Jesus preserves his authority and says, that's an okay idea to send them home, but I have a better idea, which will get us even further ahead by feeding all these people right now, right? So in some ways, you could see this as the portrait of two types of leaders, right? Two types of hosts. One who's just fundamentally selfish and foolish, and the other who is fundamentally good and generous, but also very much in control. Like often when we think about being good Christians, it's always about, well, what does everybody else want? My viewpoint doesn't matter. We're always tempted to just sort of devolve to others, not devolve, but like delegate and so forth to others. What does everybody else want? Jesus is saying, no, actually, if you've got a better idea, which is generous and effective, act on it. You don't just have to say, what does everybody else think? If you've got a better idea, act on it. Hold your ground. Our goal here is to be good and to be generous, not to just do whatever the crowd is asking.
And Jesus is in Abram's footsteps there. Like Abram, God's going to mete out judgment on wicked people, but Abram perseveres respectfully to a point, but he acts on his own ideas. There could be righteous people. I don't want them. It could be my nephew. I don't want them destroyed. So he's not afraid to stand up for his point of view.
Very good point. And actually it makes me think Lot actually gives in to the point of view of the crowd. He says, I won't give you the angels, but I'll give you my daughters. He doesn't say no.
His no isn't a no. It's an evasion.
Yeah.
To preserve his own self-image of being a good host.
And he's conceding to the terms of the mob outside. They've said, give us somebody to abuse. And he says, well, you can't have them, but you can have these two, right? Whereas Jesus's example seems to be, no, that's not a good idea. I'm not going to do that. I have a better idea. I have a better idea which is in keeping with generosity and compassion, right? And Lot is not considered the senior member of Abraham and Lot, right? Like Abraham's always presented as the better person. So it's interesting that Lot is only kind of halfway there, whereas Abraham's all the way there. He's going to defend even the people of Sodom, right? You know, what if there were 10 good people there, right? So I totally agree with you, Wendy. I think that's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment that the difference between these individuals, to me, it seems that the ones who were in relationship with the divine or with God, they were not just acting on their own will as the ones who, you know, did the bad stuff. So I see it as they were acting in relationship with God, and that's why they acted the way they did.
Yeah, because there's an extravagant generosity in evidence with both Abraham and Jesus in these stories, right? Like Abraham really goes for it for these strangers, and Jesus like goes for it plus some. I mean, we're told that there's a lot of leftovers, no less, right? And it's a nice image of God's generosity, right? That there's always leftovers. It's not just enough. You know, no one goes away hungry, and in fact, they bring back baskets which are extra. And I think that's supposed to tell us, you know, God who makes the entire world go round, that allows an oak tree to drop 10,000 acorns in a single season, even though probably none of them will become oak trees in the long run. That's the way God operates, with extravagant generosity. So I'm looking at the time, guys. We're almost done. Thank you for your generosity of showing up on a nice evening to listen to and talk about the Bible. I hope it's been helpful in some way.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, it's very different, but it's good.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for showing up, and I hope I'll see many of you in Milton for the barbecue on Sunday after the church service. A firm is hosting our barbecue for everybody, and there'll be both vegan and carnivorous options, of course.
My wish is that as a country, as people, we could be generous to others and not just indulgent of ourselves. I think that's where our society has got to in terms of its economics and its planning for finances. We're all very comfortable being generous to ourselves, but we need to be willing to be overly, extravagantly generous with other people.
Thank you, Wendy. And Anne?
Yes, I wanted to say that what I find amazing about this country is that in the middle of a big blizzard and snow everywhere, and you know, snow up to here, strangers will help each other and shovel snow and look out for each other. That just always, to me, this is what the feast is about. It's strangers being generous and helping each other. And that's very special about this country.
That's good.
That's good to hear, and thank you, Stephen, very much. We had a hard time getting on tonight for some reason.
But we made it.
Yeah, that'd be good.
And I did record this.
Thank you for the Bible study for us busy people.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll put the link in the Friday update. So if you want to share this with anybody, or if you want to hear it again, you can get to it.